Anne of Bohemia didn't die from the plague like your history books claim. According to medieval chronicles, this queen met her end in the most horrifying way imaginable, sealed alive in a stone tomb, left to suffocate in absolute darkness as punishment for adultery. The crime of infidelity meant treason when you wore a crown, and the penalty wasn't a swift beheading. It was a slow, agonizing death that could stretch for hours while you clawed at unyielding stone walls. But before you accept this gruesome tale as historical fact, you need to understand something crucial about medieval storytelling and the dangerous power of legends that refuse to die. The story has haunted historical records for centuries, whispered in corners about a queen who dared betray her royal husband and paid the ultimate price. Palace chroniclers wrote of muffled screams echoing from sealed chambers, of servants who claimed to hear scratching sounds coming from beneath the floor stones days after the punishment began. These accounts describe a woman who went from beloved noblewoman to cautionary tale in a matter of weeks, her alleged crime so scandalous that even execution by sword seemed too merciful. What makes this tale particularly chilling is how it reflects the medieval world's obsession with female purity and the lengths royal courts would go to preserve their honor. When a queen committed adultery, she didn't just betray her husband, she potentially corrupted the entire bloodline, throwing succession into chaos and undermining the divine right of kings. The punishment had to match the magnitude of the crime, serving as a warning that would echo through generations of noble women who might consider similar transgressions. Yet something doesn't add up about this terrifying narrative. The more you dig into the historical record, the more the official story starts to crumble, revealing a complex web of political intrigue, medieval misogyny, and the dangerous power of myths that take on a life of their own. The real Anne of Bohemia lived a remarkably different story than the one carved in stone tombstones and whispered in royal corridors. Born in 1366, she became queen consort to England's King Richard II through a carefully orchestrated diplomatic marriage that linked the Holy Roman Empire to the English crown. This wasn't a love match, it was statecraft at its most calculated, designed to strengthen political alliances across medieval Europe. Her actual life reads like a manual for proper queenly behavior. Anne threw herself into peaceful diplomacy, using her position to smooth over conflicts between warring noble factions. She became known for her charitable works, her support of religious institutions, and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics without creating enemies. Palace records show a woman who understood the precarious nature of royal life and played her role with careful precision. The historical Anne never faced accusations of adultery or treason. Court documents from her era paint a consistent picture of a queen who maintained proper decorum throughout her marriage. She attended religious services regularly, participated in state ceremonies, and fulfilled all the traditional duties expected of a medieval queen consort. Her correspondence with other European nobles reveals a woman focused on maintaining peaceful relationships and advancing England's diplomatic interests. Her marriage to Richard II, while arranged for political purposes, appears to have been cordial if not passionate. There are no surviving letters between them suggesting marital discord, no court gossip recorded by contemporary chroniclers about infidelity, and no evidence of the kind of public scandal that would typically precede such a dramatic punishment. The couple maintained separate households, as was common among medieval royalty, but this was standard practice rather than evidence of marital problems. The documented end of Anne's life contradicts every element of the burial legend. In 1394, she fell ill at Sheen Palace during one of the periodic plague outbreaks that swept through medieval England. Palace physicians attended her, trying the limited medical treatments available at the time, but the disease progressed rapidly. Contemporary accounts describe her final days in detail. She received last rites, made provisions for her servants, and died surrounded by court officials and religious advisors. Her death devastated Richard II, who ordered the complete destruction of Sheen Palace because he couldn't bear to remain in the place where she had died. This isn't the behavior of a husband who had recently ordered his wife's execution for adultery. Instead, it suggests genuine grief and attachment that contradicts the narrative of betrayal and punishment that would later attach itself to Anne's memory. The legend of Anne's terrifying punishment appears to be a masterpiece of medieval myth-making, cobbled together from various sources and attached to her name through centuries of repetition and embellishment. Medieval Europe was full of cautionary tales about noble women who transgressed social boundaries, and the punishment of live burial, while extremely rare, existed in legal codes as a theoretical penalty for certain crimes. These stories served specific social functions in medieval society. They reinforced the importance of female chastity, demonstrated the consequences of challenging royal authority, and provided vicarious thrills for audiences hungry for scandalous entertainment. Over time, various elements from different tales began to merge and attach themselves to historical figures, creating composite legends that bore little resemblance to actual events. The specific details of live burial likely came from scattered accounts of this punishment being used in extreme cases across medieval Europe. Some legal codes did prescribe live burial for adulteresses, though actual implementation was extraordinarily rare. These theoretical punishments would be recorded in legal documents and chronicles, creating a paper trail that later storytellers could draw upon to add authenticity to their tales. Political motivations might have also played a role in attaching this particular story to Anne. Medieval chroniclers often used scandalous tales about foreign queens to promote nationalist sentiments or to justify later political actions. Anne's Bohemian origins made her an easy target for such propaganda, especially during periods when England's relationship with continental Europe became strained. The evolution of the legend reveals how medieval society processed anxieties about female power, foreign influence, and the stability of royal bloodlines. By transforming a peaceful diplomatic queen into a cautionary tale about adultery and punishment, the story served multiple social functions while completely obscuring the historical reality of Anne's actual life and death. Medieval justice operated by its own twisted logic, and noblewomen found themselves trapped within a system that viewed their bodies as political battlefields. You need to understand that accusations of adultery weren't just personal scandals for royal women, they represented threats to bloodlines, succession, and entire kingdoms. The punishments designed for such crimes reflected this terrifying reality. Being buried alive wasn't the only horrific fate awaiting noblewomen accused of infidelity. The medieval mind crafted punishments specifically tailored to strip away dignity while delivering maximum psychological torment. Some were sentenced to be walled up in monastery cells, left with just enough food and water to prolong their suffering for weeks. Others faced public humiliation before execution, forced to walk naked through jeering crowds while clergy recited their sins. The threat of being burned alive loomed over many accused noblewomen, particularly those whose alleged crimes carried hints of witchcraft or heresy alongside adultery. Fire represented purification in medieval thinking, but the reality involved excruciating minutes of conscious agony as flames consumed flesh. Palace records from various European courts document women being sentenced to drowning in sacks, thrown from castle walls, or subjected to elaborate torture devices designed to extract confessions. What's truly chilling is how these punishments served dual purposes. They weren't just about delivering justice, they were carefully orchestrated theater designed to terrorize other women into absolute submission. Medieval authorities understood that the mere possibility of such fates would keep noblewomen in line far more effectively than any sermon about virtue and duty. The documented cases reveal that actual executions of noblewomen for adultery were remarkably rare. Most accusations ended in exile, forced religious retirement, or annulled marriages. The gruesome punishments existed primarily as psychological weapons wielded through whispered threats and public proclamations. Courts would announce horrific sentences, then commute them at the last moment, leaving the condemned woman permanently marked by terror while appearing merciful to the public. Royal scandals in medieval Europe functioned as sophisticated political weapons, and accusations of adultery represented the nuclear option in courtly warfare. When you examine the timing of these scandals, patterns emerge that have nothing to do with actual infidelity and everything to do with power struggles, succession disputes, and international diplomacy. Consider how adultery accusations typically surface during moments of political upheaval. A king seeking to remarry for diplomatic reasons would suddenly discover evidence of his wife's infidelity. Rival noble families would whisper rumors about a queen's virtue just as her husband negotiated crucial treaties. These weren't coincidences, they were calculated strikes designed to destabilize enemies and justify dramatic political moves. The machinery of medieval scandal operated through a complex network of servants, courtiers, and religious authorities who could be bought, threatened, or manipulated into providing testimony. Palace staff who witnessed private moments could be convinced to reinterpret innocent interactions as evidence of treachery. Confessors might suddenly recall suspicious statements made during private religious consultations. Even physical evidence could be manufactured. Clothing planted in compromising locations, forged letters, or staged encounters designed to create damaging witness testimony. Gender played a crucial role in how these political weapons functioned. Medieval law placed women's sexuality under absolute male control, making any unauthorized intimate contact treasonous by definition. This legal framework meant that female political targets were uniquely vulnerable to sexual accusations. A male rival might face charges of rebellion or heresy, but a woman could be destroyed simply through rumors about her private conduct. The international dimension of royal scandal reveals how accusations of adultery could reshape entire diplomatic relationships. Foreign ambassadors would carry tales of Queen's alleged misconduct back to their home courts, poisoning marriage negotiations and military alliances for generations. Treaties would collapse not because of trade disputes or territorial conflicts, but because whispered stories about bedroom betrayals made political partnerships impossible. Religious authorities often found themselves caught between their spiritual duties and political pressures when these scandals erupted. Church officials who refused to support adultery accusations might face removal from their positions, while those who cooperated could expect significant rewards. This corruption of religious institutions added divine authority to political machinations, making scandal campaigns even more devastating for their targets. Your body would betray you within minutes of being sealed inside that stone tomb, though your mind would remain horrifyingly aware of every sensation. The medical reality of being buried alive represents one of the most prolonged and agonizing deaths imaginable, involving a cascade of biological failures that would unfold over terrifying hours. Oxygen deprivation begins immediately once that final stone seals your fate. The limited air trapped within the burial chamber starts its deadly countdown, and your lungs begin working overtime, desperately trying to extract every molecule of breathable gas from the shrinking supply. Within the first 10 minutes, carbon dioxide levels spike as you exhale the waste products of cellular metabolism into the confined space, creating a toxic atmosphere that your own body generates. Your brain, requiring roughly 20% of your body's oxygen supply, starts sending panic signals throughout your nervous system. Heart rate accelerates dramatically as your cardiovascular system attempts to deliver what little oxygen remains to vital organs. The sensation isn't just shortness of breath, it's the overwhelming terror of drowning while surrounded by solid stone instead of water. Hypoxia progresses in stages, each more brutal than the last. Initial symptoms include severe headache, dizziness, and nausea as your brain struggles with insufficient oxygen delivery. Your vision begins deteriorating, starting with peripheral darkness that gradually closes in like a tunnel. Cognitive function deteriorates rapidly. Rational thought becomes impossible as primal survival instincts take control of whatever consciousness remains. The physical symptoms escalate beyond mental confusion into total bodily rebellion. Violent convulsions rack your frame as your nervous system misfires in oxygen-starved desperation. Your lungs burn with each increasingly futile breath, while your heart pounds irregularly as it struggles to circulate blood that carries less and less life-sustaining oxygen. Fingernails would be scraped bloody against stone walls in frantic attempts to claw through solid rock. Temperature regulation fails as your body's systems shut down in sequence. Despite the cool stone environment, you'd experience alternating waves of fever and chills as your thermoregulatory mechanisms collapse. Profuse sweating would soak through clothing even as hypothermia begins setting in, creating a miserable combination of overheating and freezing simultaneously. The final stages involve complete cardiovascular collapse as your heart muscle, starved of oxygen like every other tissue, begins failing to maintain circulation. Blood pressure drops catastrophically while your pulse becomes weak and irregular before stopping entirely. Brain death follows within minutes of cardiac arrest, though the exact timing would depend on factors like the tomb's size, air quality, and your physical condition. What makes this particular method of execution so psychologically devastating is the extended period of conscious awareness during the dying process. Unlike a swift beheading or hanging, burial alive provides ample time to experience every stage of biological failure while remaining mentally aware of the hopeless situation. The combination of physical agony and psychological torture created a death that medieval minds considered appropriately horrific for the worst possible crimes. Anne of Bohemia never faced a stone tomb in her final moments. Palace records from Sheen Palace tell a different story entirely. On June 7, 1394, the queen consort lay dying from plague, the same merciless disease that swept through medieval England like wildfire. Court physicians documented her symptoms: high fever, swollen lymph nodes, delirium, no accusations of adultery, no burial preparations, just a woman succumbing to an illness that claimed thousands. The official records paint a devastatingly ordinary picture. Anne had been married to Richard II for 12 years, their union serving as a diplomatic bridge between England and the Holy Roman Empire. Contemporary chroniclers describe their relationship as affectionate, even devoted. When she died, Richard's grief consumed him so completely that he ordered Sheen Palace destroyed. The place where she had drawn her last breath became too painful for him to bear. You won't find any medieval accounts describing Anne being dragged to a tomb. Instead, witness accounts from her deathbed describe a king who refused to leave his wife's side. Court records show Richard holding her hand as plague ravaged her body, staying with her through fevered nightmares and moments of clarity. The same man who supposedly ordered her buried alive for infidelity couldn't bring himself to abandon her bedside during her final illness. Her funeral was public, elaborate, and witnessed by hundreds. Anne's body was interred at Westminster Abbey with full royal honors, not sealed away in some hidden stone chamber. The tomb remains there today, carved with effigies of both Anne and Richard, their stone hands nearly touching for eternity. No medieval chronicler mentions crowds gathering to witness a live burial. No accounts exist of muffled screams or desperate clawing at stone walls. The documented timeline of Anne's death spans several days, not the horrific minutes of suffocation that legend describes. Court records track her decline, initial fever, consulting physicians, administering last rites, and finally peaceful death surrounded by attendants and clergy. Her ladies-in-waiting recorded prayers spoken over her body, not the frantic burial of a condemned adulteress. Medieval record-keeping was meticulous when it came to royal deaths, especially controversial ones. Executions were public spectacles, documented in detail to serve as warnings. If Anne had been buried alive for adultery, chronicles would have recorded every gruesome moment. Instead, the historical record remains consistent across multiple sources. Plague took Anne of Bohemia, not royal vengeance. The contrast between myth and reality reveals something profound about how we remember the past. Anne's actual death, painful but natural, surrounded by love rather than condemnation, gets overshadowed by a fabricated horror story that never happened. The woman who died holding her husband's hand becomes transformed into a cautionary tale about infidelity and punishment. Truth becomes less compelling than legend, and Anne's real story disappears beneath layers of fictional brutality that make for better storytelling than historical fact. Historical figures become prisoners of the stories we tell about them. Anne of Bohemia's reputation suffers from a phenomenon historians call mythological displacement, where invented stories gradually replace documented facts in popular memory. Her actual life fades while her fictional death grows more vivid with each retelling. This process destroys nuanced understanding of medieval people. Anne becomes a symbol rather than a person, her diplomatic achievements and personal relationships erased by tales of adultery and live burial. The queen who helped broker peace between warring factions becomes reduced to a victim of male vengeance, her agency and intelligence stripped away by myth. Consider how this affects our understanding of medieval women's lives. When fictional punishments dominate historical memory, we lose sight of real struggles these women faced. Anne navigated complex political alliances, managed vast households, and influenced international relations. Those accomplishments vanish when her story becomes solely about alleged sexual transgression and gruesome death. The mythology also distorts our perception of medieval justice. Richard II's actual reign included genuine controversies and real executions, but these documented events get overshadowed by fabricated horror stories. We end up with a cartoonish understanding of medieval punishment that emphasizes sensational brutality over the complex reality of how medieval courts actually operated. Legends reshape not just individual reputations but entire historical periods. When Anne's story gets reduced to burial alive for adultery, it reinforces stereotypes about medieval society being uniformly barbaric toward women. The nuanced reality that while women faced significant legal restrictions, live burial was not a standard punishment for adultery, disappears beneath the more dramatic fictional version. Her transformed legacy affects how we view relationships between medieval rulers and their spouses. Richard II's genuine grief over Anne's death from plague becomes forgotten, replaced by an image of him as a monster who condemned his wife to suffocation. Their documented affection and partnership gets erased by a story that never happened, fundamentally altering how we understand their marriage and Richard's character. The mythologizing process reveals our own preferences for sensation over subtlety. Anne's real death from plague lacks the dramatic elements that make stories memorable, so the invented version with its horrific punishment persists while the truth fades. We prefer our historical figures to embody extreme experiences rather than the complex realities of actual medieval life. This phenomenon extends beyond Anne to countless historical figures whose real stories get buried under layers of fictional elaboration. The accumulation of these myths creates a distorted understanding of the past, where sensational fabrications crowd out documented experiences and achievements. Anne of Bohemia becomes a cautionary example of how easily historical truth can be overwhelmed by more compelling fiction. Medieval society transformed rumors into weapons of political warfare. Stories about Anne's alleged adultery and horrific punishment spread not because they were true, but because they served specific purposes for those who propagated them. Political enemies of Richard II could use tales of his wife's supposed infidelity to undermine his authority and legitimacy. The medieval information network operated through oral tradition, manuscript copying, and traveling storytellers. Unlike modern fact-checking mechanisms, these systems amplified rather than corrected misinformation. A story that began as political gossip could evolve through multiple retellings until it became accepted as historical fact. Anne's fabricated punishment grew more elaborate with each version, accumulating horrific details that served the storyteller's need for audience engagement. Religious authorities also played a role in perpetuating certain myths that aligned with their moral teachings. Tales of women severely punished for adultery reinforced church doctrine about marital fidelity and female virtue. Anne's story, though fabricated, provided a useful cautionary example that clergy could cite to illustrate the consequences of sexual transgression. Truth became less important than moral instruction. The storytelling tradition that preserved Anne's myth reveals changing attitudes across centuries. As societies developed different views about women, marriage, and royal authority, Anne's story adapted to reflect contemporary concerns rather than medieval reality. Each generation retold her tale in ways that resonated with their own anxieties about power, gender, and justice. These myths also functioned as entertainment in societies with limited recreational options. Horrific stories about royal scandals provided vicarious thrills for audiences who had little access to other forms of dramatic narrative. Anne's supposed burial alive offered the kind of visceral shock that audiences craved, making her fictional death more memorable than thousands of real medieval women whose actual struggles went unrecorded. The persistence of false stories about Anne demonstrates how difficult it becomes to correct historical misinformation once it takes root. Even when scholars present evidence of her actual death from plague, the more sensational version continues to circulate because it serves emotional and entertainment needs that factual history cannot match. Society chooses compelling fiction over documentary truth. Modern media continues this pattern, amplifying sensational historical claims without rigorous fact-checking. Anne's story spreads through websites, documentaries, and popular history books that prioritize audience engagement over historical accuracy. The medieval rumor mill has evolved into digital format, but the underlying dynamic remains unchanged. Dramatic fiction overwhelms documented fact. The reaction to Anne's myth also reveals deep-seated fears about female sexuality and power. The story's enduring appeal suggests continued fascination with punishment of women who allegedly transgress sexual boundaries. Her fictional fate resonates with audiences who find satisfaction in seeing powerful women brought low, even when that satisfaction is based on complete fabrication rather than historical reality. When historians started digging into the gruesome tale of Anne of Bohemia's alleged burial, they found something far more disturbing than any medieval execution. They found nothing at all. Court records from Richard II's reign document everything from wine purchases to diplomatic correspondence, yet not a single mention exists of adultery charges against his queen. Palace chronicles that gleefully recorded scandals involving other nobles fall completely silent when it comes to Anne's supposed infidelity. The silence becomes deafening when you realize how medieval courts operated. These weren't private affairs conducted in shadowy corners. Royal accusations of adultery required formal proceedings, witness testimony, and extensive documentation. When Anne Boleyn faced similar charges centuries later, the paperwork alone filled volumes. Every aspect was recorded, from the initial accusations to the final execution. Medieval courts were even more bureaucratic, obsessively documenting royal proceedings down to the smallest detail. Professional historians who've spent decades studying Richard II's reign describe the burial story as historically impossible. The timeline doesn't work. The political context makes no sense. The complete absence of contemporary sources renders the tale fiction masquerading as history. Dr. Caroline Barron, a leading expert on medieval English queens, points out that Anne's death in 1394 is thoroughly documented as occurring from plague at Sheen Palace, with Richard II himself present and grief-stricken. The forensic evidence tells an equally damning story. Medieval punishment records, gruesome as they often were, followed predictable patterns. Executions of nobility were public spectacles designed to demonstrate royal power. They were witnessed, recorded, and discussed for generations. The alleged secret burial would have violated every principle of medieval justice, which relied on public demonstration of consequences. Archaeological investigations have turned up no evidence whatsoever of unusual burial sites associated with Anne of Bohemia. Medieval tombs, especially those of executed nobles, leave traces that survive centuries. The stone chambers described in the legend would have required significant construction, leaving archaeological footprints that simply don't exist. The story's proponents can't explain why such a momentous event would vanish from historical record while far less significant court proceedings were meticulously documented. They can't account for the complete absence of contemporary witness accounts in a period when court gossip was the primary form of political communication. Most tellingly, they can't explain how a tale of such magnitude could exist without leaving any physical evidence. When pressed for sources, supporters of the legend invariably point to much later accounts, often written centuries after the supposed events. These secondary sources cite each other in an endless loop, creating the illusion of multiple confirmations while actually representing a single, unsubstantiated claim repeated across time. The academic consensus is clear and unanimous. The story of Anne of Bohemia's burial alive represents historical fiction, not historical fact. Professional medievalists, archaeologists, and legal historians all reach the same conclusion when examining the evidence. There isn't any. The tale survives not because it's true, but because it's compelling enough to repeat, disturbing enough to remember, and medieval enough to seem plausible to modern audiences unfamiliar with how thoroughly documented medieval royal courts actually were. The legend of Anne of Bohemia's horrific punishment reveals something far more insidious than medieval cruelty. It exposes how easily fabricated stories can masquerade as historical truth when they confirm our darkest assumptions about the past. The tale persists precisely because it aligns with modern expectations of medieval brutality toward women, creating a perfect storm of historical misinformation disguised as forbidden knowledge. These myths don't exist in a vacuum. They serve specific purposes, functioning as cautionary tales that reinforce particular views about gender, power, and sexuality. The image of a queen buried alive for adultery sends a clear message about female agency and the consequences of challenging male authority. The story's supposed historical basis gives it weight that pure fiction couldn't achieve, making it a powerful tool for perpetuating specific social attitudes. Medieval women faced genuine oppression and violence, but fabricating additional horrors doesn't honor their memory or illuminate their struggles. It trivializes real suffering while creating false narratives that obscure actual historical patterns of abuse and control. The documented lives of medieval queens reveal complex webs of political maneuvering, diplomatic marriage, and limited but real forms of agency. These authentic stories deserve attention instead of being overshadowed by sensationalized fiction. The persistence of such legends also highlights the dangerous appeal of historical conspiracy theories. The idea that mainstream historians are hiding disturbing truths creates an alluring sense of forbidden knowledge. People want to believe they're accessing secret information unavailable to the masses. This desire makes them vulnerable to accepting unsupported claims that promise to reveal hidden horrors. Educational institutions bear responsibility for this historical confusion. Textbooks that oversimplify medieval life without providing sufficient context create fertile ground for more dramatic alternatives. Students who learn that the Middle Ages were uniformly brutal and oppressive are primed to accept extreme examples that confirm this oversimplified narrative. The real lesson from examining Anne of Bohemia's legend isn't about medieval punishment or royal adultery. It's about the importance of historical literacy in an age of information overload. The skills required to evaluate historical claims, cross-reference sources, and distinguish between documented facts and compelling fiction are more crucial than ever. Modern audiences must learn to question appealing narratives that confirm their existing beliefs about the past. Historical accuracy matters not just for academic integrity, but for understanding how power, gender, and social control actually functioned in different eras. The authentic stories of medieval women, complex and often tragic, provide genuine insights into historical patterns of oppression and resistance. The fabricated tale of Anne of Bohemia's burial serves as a perfect case study in how myths can overwhelm facts when they're emotionally compelling enough. Her real story, that of a diplomatic queen who died of plague while trying to bridge political divides, offers more valuable lessons about medieval female agency than any fictional account of extreme punishment ever could.